And this is a new tape,
Hey.
right? Hey.
Change hunt?
Okay, so this is the River Runners Oral History Project. This is September 14th, 1994, and we're here at overlooking Crystal Rapid with John Cross Sr. and John Cross Jr. And this is part 2. Can you hear me okay?
No, you'll need to speak louder for me to hear when you're talking to me,
Okay.
asking questions.
And this is part 2 of an interview we started earlier last night. And same people are present. Jeff Robertson, Lew Steiger, and Karen Underhill. I guess maybe we ought to start with just your sense of Glen. Now, Senior, you started there in Glen Canyon with the Boy Scouts.
Correct.
Can you tell us a little bit about that first trip and your first impression of the river and that canyon?
Well, of course, the first trip was a big adventure, not only for the boys, but for me, because I'd never been on the river before. And it was exciting as we turned the bends and saw new sights, and as the light of the day brightened, the colors changed in the rocks. There were just so many things that were different and fascinating and interesting to me. I decided on that first trip that if I was involved in the future, that I would become as familiar with things as I could in a general way to share that with the boys, draw attention to the Indian ruins along the way, the pictographs and petroglyphs and various rock formations, geological formations that were of interest. Not only that, but also the water and its changes in flow. Those days we used to see what we call sand boils, and sometimes they'd be very intense in some areas, and the water would just suddenly, it would be smooth and calm, and in moments it would suddenly boil up and bubble like there was something beneath that was heating it up, and then it would spring off into back eddies, and these were exciting because if we got a boat into one of them and it was a big enough sand boil, they would actually stop the boat and hold it there till the bubbling was over, and then you get cast off and maybe into a back eddy, and you'd be headed back upstream for a short distance. They weren't long distance things. Sand waves were another thing that was extremely exciting to us, because a sand wave, as it starts with a single wave across the river, across the current, and it's rather low, close to the surface. The next wave that forms upstream from that one, and they continue to move upstream, and they reach a point where you have a high spot in them, and then they taper off again and drop off to nothing. So the profile from the side is that you have low waves gradually getting larger, then you reach the peak, and then they taper off till the last wave. And they never move. The waves stand still, but the water goes up over the top of them. And on an occasion, we ran waves that we estimated to be about 12 to 14 feet high.
In Glen Canyon?
In the Glen Canyon. And on these waves, we found out very quickly that if a rubber boat went up on them straight, following the current, half of the boat was out of the water, and when it came down with a clatter and a bang, and the back end flipped up, and there was a chance of losing gear or passengers. So we learned very quickly to ride them on a quartered on about a 45-degree angle to the waves, and then we could roll over them rather than being flipped and flopped on them. But this was an exciting thing always, to have a chance to ride the sand waves. Now that was interesting too, because as we were gathering information about the river and from people who had had some experiences, Dr. Russell G. Fraser, who had been on the river, indicated that that was one of the great things to worry about, were the sand waves. They were extremely dangerous, but they were just nothing but fun for the scouts because we learned how to conquer them very early in the program. I was probably personally more affected by the tremendous numbers of Indian ruins, the granaries, the dwellings. At the mouth of White Canyon was one that was referred to as a fortress, standing out in an open spot on the rock right at the edge of the river, and there was evidence that it had been about 4 stories high. But at the time we first saw it, there was about 2.5 stories of it still standing. But this was a great place to stop and be able to tell some of the stories, history of the Anasazis and other tribes that were more recent. We had each member of the crew equipped with a 5-foot paddle, excepting the captain. He served as a tiller, and he had a 6-foot paddle for tilling purposes, but we used to tell the boys that the real purpose behind this was his paddle was a foot longer than any of the rest of them, so be sure and do what he tells you, because you can't outfight him. And every boy had an assigned segment of the program, something to do. In each boat we had one adult, no more. And the purpose of the adult in that boat was in an emergency only. He held no responsibility of guiding and directing unless an emergency came up and advice had to be extended. The boys did all of their own programming and responsibility. The health and safety officer was taught how to handle a ring buoy with a 50-foot line and how to throw it upstream above the person who might be in the water so it drifted down to them, rather than hitting them with it or throwing it short so that they couldn't get to it, and this sort of stuff. But again, the boys were responsible. That was their program. We had a log keeper in each of the expeditions that was elected by the boys, and he wrote a record as we went along, and then that was transcribed when we got back off of the trip, and every participant then received a copy of that. And I still have men who were on the river with me ask me if there is any possibility that they could get a copy of the log because they've lost theirs or it's gone by the wayside, and I still have an original on every one of those river programs. So it's nice to be able to share with these young kids with gray hair now as they remember things that was exciting. I don't recall more than maybe once or twice in 27 trips I took down the Glen Canyon, seeing the wind blow downstream. It always blew upstream if it blew at all. Downstream was good when it occurred because we could take a couple of paddles and hold them up with a tarp between them and use them as sails, but it just didn't happen that often.
How'd you meet Bert Loper, and what was he like?
All right, that's a good question, because Al Quist, who was making contacts with people who'd had experiences on or with the river, had contacted everybody that he could get a hold of or identify, and quizzed them and asked for their advice and counsel. Among those people that were contacted was Bert Loper, who was living at the time at Green River. Bert was invited to come as the guide if he could do so, but he was unable. We made a contact with Kent Frost, and he was able to come on the first trip, so we picked him up at Green River and carried him on down to Hanksville and down to North Wash for our embarkation. There is some misunderstanding about Bert and Kent. Kent was the first guide for the Boy Scout operation. Just after our first trip was finished, I think it was the 6th of June in 1947, Al Quist transferred his programming from Salt Lake Council as a professional scouter into the 3G Council of Safford, Arizona. At that point, the man who took his place, Joe Dyer, kind of let me initiate the efforts to organize a second trip. However, excuse me, as we got close to the departure date, we had no one to guide us. I had been down the river, but I didn't know very much about it. Consequence of this was that we decided we were so far into the program, the best thing we could do was to go ahead with it and do the best we could do. Part of that was to stop in Green River and see if we might be able to make contact with Bert Loper, which we did. When we got to his home, Bert was there, and his lovely wife, Rachel, a tremendous person, was there. We talked to him, told him what we needed, what we wanted, what we hoped he could do for us, and he was a little reluctant at first. He couldn't believe that we would be so foolish as to use a rubber boat. We tried to convince him that this was good business. The interesting thing was, as we progressed in our conversations, Rachel encouraged him to join us. And Bert finally says, "All right, I'll go. But I've got to have my own boat. And I've got to take my Coleman stove. I can't go without him." Well, both of these situations were contrary to the regulation of the National Council of Boy Scouts of America, under whose tour permit our council was functioning. I debated in my mind how I could resolve this problem if I could, and finally I told Bert I'd make a split with him. I said, "If you'll give in on one item, I'll give in on the other." And he said yes. He didn't think much, I guess, about the fact that I was going to get rid of his boat first. That was a serious problem, because we had registered our application with the National Council to run on these inflatable rubber boats. Had we had a mishap with a different type of boat in the flotilla, then we would have been in serious trouble, because we broke our contract, so to speak. I told him that both things were against regulations, but if he'd give up his boat, we'd fix a place in the front end of our boat, a lead boat each day, and pad it, and he could lay in there if he wanted, or sit in there and lean back against the forward seat, and it would be extremely comfortable, and if there was anything he needed, it would be there for him. And he finally conceded to this, knowing that he was going to get to take his Coleman stove to do his cooking on. I talked to all of the crews after we got organized and formed up, and quietly told them that in turn they had the responsibility to provide their breakfast early in the morning and their meals, and get them to Bert Loper before he had time to get his Coleman stove out. Because liquid fuel, once again, was a prohibited item on these ventures. Bert, it was interesting, because about the third day out, Bert was seated in a very comfortable position in his boat, and he looked up at me. I was standing on the shore, and he said, "John, I've reached a point where when I cross the river Styx, I want it to be in a rubber boat." That didn't happen, but it was an interesting comment. As we proceeded with our programs, we got so much publicity and so much enthusiasm. We got back to Salt Lake City off of the first trip. The second one was already refilled up, and we ran 2 trips that first year, Kent guiding the first, Bert guiding the second. Right now, the next year, Al Quist was out of the scene. I set up the programs, and I had 4 of them functioning, and I guided those 4 expeditions on the Glen Canyon. I had other help from the council office, but none of them had pursued this guiding prospect. I had in 1944, late 1944 or 45, seen a picture, I think as I mentioned earlier, shown by D. Wayne Nickel of a USGS trip immediately after the war, and that kind of ate away at my mind that, hey, that's something that I ought to do, and that would be a neat thing for boys to be able to do. And it caught fire. People got enthused about it. Leaders did, parents did, boys did. Well, we set up these 4 trips, and then in order to honor and recognize the boys, we decided to hold a big, what we called a post of honor or a recognition program, which was held in the Salt Lake Tribune Auditorium in Salt Lake City. On that occasion, we invited Don Harris and Bert Loper, of course, and other people who had been on the river with us, their parents and friends, and other river runners who might want to come and see our pictures. And that's primarily what we were going to do. The award segment was to present each participant with an embroidered patch to wear on their uniform. Now, at this time, we asked Bert to say a few words. And it was somewhat startling to everybody assembled as he stood up and made statements to the effect, "This is the greatest experience I've ever had, and I want every one of you to know what tremendous young men we have with these Boy Scouts." He said, "I heard no swearing, I heard no cross words, there was no use of tobacco," and Bert was violently opposed to the use of tobacco anyway. But there was just nothing complimentary or good that Bert didn't say about those boys. He was very much impressed. The boys loved him. They could sit at his feet and listen to his stories. He was courteous to them. He never demanded anything of them. But from his words, we can see maybe he didn't have to demand of them. They were giving the best that was in themselves to make this a great experience in God's great outdoors. There was on that occasion a tribute returned to Bert, an expression of our love and concern for him and gratitude for the way he had served us. As soon as these trips were over, I had been offered a position in the professional ranks of scouting in Provo, Utah, on the Utah National Parks Council, and I decided to move into that position. When I went down there, it was in mid-48, and one of the first things was an interest in whether or not we could set up a trip on the Colorado in 1949. But some of the people in the council, before I became associated with them, set up a trip. And the scout executive, Roland Doman, had been on one of our trips with Bert earlier, and he recruited Bert to run this trip for the Utah National Parks Council. Now, Bert agreed to do that. There is a very significant thing about this particular expedition and Bert Loper. I had somewhat of a feeling, I don't know where it come from, but I could never expand on it, that there had been a trip, that Salt Lake and Bert Loper and the Utah National Parks Council were kind of entangled in a sense. What actually occurred was Bert took a trip down for the Utah National Parks Council while I was still associated in Salt Lake. And recently I found a log of that trip. Now, when I got down in '49, set up a trip with the Utah National Parks Council now as guide, I had no more direct contact with what was happening in Salt Lake Council. I do know that there was some scout trips taken, but I knew nothing about the guides and what occurred and how it happened. Here on this great adventure that we are participating in today, 2 nights ago I sat with Gene Shoemaker and we exchanged experiences. He said, "John, I was on the Glen Canyon in 1949. And he said, I was just either a little bit ahead of you or a little bit behind you." And that amazed me. I didn't know Gene Shoemaker until we got together on this trip. Interestingly enough then, as we talked back and forth, little bits and pieces started to come together, and I said, let's go back to the beginning. I don't recall what he said his purpose down there was, but he was there. But he said one of the great adventures was that he met Bert Loper down there. Well, now here we are, Bert Loper and I, just somewhere within a week span. And I knew nothing about him being on the river. I didn't have to know, but I would like to have known. Gene says, I said, what was he doing? And he says, well, he was taking a group of scouts down. And I said, where were they from? And he said, Salt Lake City. He said, I met Bert in his boat at height. Now, I'm presuming this until I have chance to pursue it further. Bert must have brought his boat down the Green River, from Green River, Utah to Height, Utah. Here he met the Boy Scouts, contrary to the rules and regulations. He led that expedition in rubber boats with him in his own boat. Disadvantage, he couldn't have himself with the boys to share with them while they were on the river the stories and information and whatnot. But the fascinating thing about it was, Gene told me that he met Bert a second time down near Aztec Canyon. This is where we stopped off to make our trek up to Rainbow Bridge. Now, I had been invited to participate when Bert Loper was going to make his trip, which turned out to be his last and final trip in the Grand Canyon. But I couldn't do it because I had a scheduled boys' trip in the canyon. Art Green, who used to be at Marble Canyon, had that big airboat with the Navajo name on it, the trail to the rock that goes over. He said, John, if you're going to be down there about Aztec Canyon the day that Bert's group put off from Lee's Ferry, I'll come up in my boat and pick you up, take you down so you can be with them when they depart. Well, that would have been nice, but it would have done two things. One of them, it would have left my group without leadership in a land they didn't know. And it would open me to the possibility, should there be an accident or something occur that would prevent me getting back up to those boys, from doing the job that I had agreed to do. So I rejected the offer. I did not go down. But this was the thing that I got from Gene that was so fascinating. Bert Loper, one, brought his boat from Green River to Height, apparently alone, or if there was anyone else in it, we didn't talk about that, but I'm going to seek that out. Then he guided a group of scouts from Salt Lake, from Height down to Lee's Ferry. There he joined the party of men with whom he entered the Grand Canyon on his final trip. Now, this was something that came to me as we put pieces together 2 nights ago through the courtesies of Gene Shoemaker. Way beyond my belief of finding out such information, but a real blessing for the history of scouting on the river front.
That's when old Bert he was 80 then.
Yes, he was. Bert had been in the Grand Canyon with Don Harris to celebrate his 70th birthday. And he insisted that he was going to be back with him to celebrate his 80th birthday. And this was the year of his 80th birthday, and his wish was filled in part, at any rate.
What was Kent Frost like on that first trip?
Pardon?
What was Kent Frost like on that first trip?
Kent Frost was a great guy. He was young enough to be one of us. And he had spent his life out in the out-of-doors and was familiar with the country, surrounding the river area. He had been on the rivers on several different occasions and several different rivers. He knew what he was doing. He got along well with the boys. I think one thing that was admirable about him was that he didn't issue commands. He functioned in a manner that he did the thing that he was qualified to do. That was to guide us. And then those who had the responsibility within the Boy Scout organization did what commanding had to be done. But the boys loved and enjoyed Kent Frost. He got along well with them, and it's been a real pleasure for me to know Kent over these many, many years. And again, to be with him here on this great adventure.
Yeah, how's this trip strike you? Just this trip itself, what did you think of when they asked you to do it, and how are you feeling about it right now, just being a part of it?
I'm still wondering how they got my name. I'm happy to do anything I can to share anything that I've got that's going to provide truth of an occurrence and facts about it.
How did you feel when you heard that, was Glen Canyon Dam already a foregone conclusion then, or how did you feel when they decided to build the dam? What did you think about that?
I'm a peculiar person, I guess, because I don't believe that anything stands still. If we're going to have progress, we've got to have changes. You cannot leave things as they are and progress or grow, in my estimation. I hated to see, in one respect, all of the beauty of the Glen Canyon underwater, no longer accessible to visit and view as we had done up to that point in time. But the area itself, of course, was opened up to thousands upon thousands more people to enjoy and participate in recreational boating. Needs for the power to provide electrical supplies into the southwest was met. I guess maybe one thing that I could say is I've listened to people complain about putting in the dam to develop power to provide electricity for their home, to keep them cool, or to keep them lighted, or to keep them heated, depending upon the time of the year. It seems like if we want to progress and gain advantages and developments, put them to use, we have to sacrifice some things. I believe that all of the blessings and benefits that come in many directions, irrigation and all these other things we've talked about, outweigh what we lost. A few of us, relatively speaking, who had seen it. I think the benefits and the blessings by far outweigh what we lost. Now, there are other places we can go. We can't see the exact spot, but we can see similar things like we're experiencing now. When I finally severed my connection with the Boy Scouts of America on a professional basis in September of 1961, formed Cross Tours and Explorations as a family corporation, and became involved in commercial boating. My boys were getting old enough and had some experience, particularly John, to assume responsibility on the rivers. Now, the point I want to make, in the interim, since that time, any time I have traveled the river with anybody, whether it was John, whether it was one of my other sons, whether it was a hired personnel in my operation, our operation, or whether it's the personnel on this expedition, it is not my intent, I will not do it, and that is to give instruction or counsel or suggestions on how to run a rapid or whether to go here or whether to go there. I respect these people and the responsibility they've assumed, and they need my support, if in nothing else or other way, to keep my mouth shut and let them do the job that they are there to do in a manner that they know how to do it and feel comfortable with it. Because that comfort thing is the thing that makes most of their experiences and their successful runs through rapids, for example, a success.